I have referenced my religious conversion experience back in 1979 outside the context of any particular religious ideology, doctrine, system, whatever. And that at that time, I studied various scriptures and whatnot and ended up, being attracted to the teachings of Mahayana Buddhism. At that time, I lived in a rural area, and again, back in 1979, you could go to a bookstore and there just wasn't much in terms of, books about Buddhism. But I had the good fortune to be exposed to a bookstore that had some volumes, one of which, to my great satisfaction and subsequent feeling of deep gratitude, was the Lankavatara Sutra. Other than a brief reference in the poem that I recited in another video, I haven't said much to this point about the Lankavatara, but in many ways it is the most psychologically oriented of the Mahayana Sutras, the Great Vehicle Sutras, and from that standpoint had kind of a special appeal to me, given that my training was in psychology. What I'd like to do is to recite a few brief passages from the volume of the Lankavatara Sutra that I was studying at that time, and maybe give a comment or two about some of these brief passages. Specifically, the volume that I'll be reading from is called on its title page, the Lankavatara Sutra, a Mahayana text, translated for the first time from the original Sanskrit by Daisetsu Taichiro Suzuki, D.T. Suzuki. And it was published by Routledge and Kegan out of London. And it was first published in 1932 and then reprinted several times subsequent to that. So in chapter 1, it says in the Lankavatara, because of reality, the Tathagatas do not discriminate. They go beyond discrimination and futile reasoning. They do not follow the individuation aspect of forms, except when reality is disclosed for the edification of the unknowing and for the sake of their happiness. It is by transcendental wisdom or prajna that the Tathagata performs deeds transcending forms. Therefore, what constitutes the Tathagatas in essence as well as in body is wisdom. They do not discriminate, nor are they discriminated. And then a paragraph or so further, the phrase, all things have no reality. So here we see a very clear and explicit communication of the profound principle of non-duality. But at the same time, a follow-up to this non-discriminatory perspective, which is the essence of prajna or wisdom, a follow-up to that with the notion of what we have seen in the Lotus Sutra, the second chapter, being the use of skillful or expedient means. In other words, even though the Tathagata is aware of and sensitized to and perceives the unreality of all ways of viewing discriminations of this versus that the Tathagata nonetheless dives back into the world of discrimination in order to find ways to teach beings, to teach persons, to engage in practices that can help them, practices and beliefs that can help them deal with and cope with their various life circumstances that are causing suffering for them. That last quote, by the way, was in chapter 1. This next one says, the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas will before long attain to the understanding that nirvana and samsara are one. Their conduct will be in accordance with the effortless exhibition of a great loving heart that ingeniously contrives means of salvation, knowing that all beings have the nature of being like a vision or a reflection, and that there is one thing which is not bound by causation, being beyond the distinction of subject and object. So in here is the same notion as we see in the Heart Sutra, and I'll probably recite one or more versions of the Heart Sutra sometime in the future. I did recite a portion which references the idea that nirvana and samsara are one, basically in terms of the idea that form is emptiness and emptiness is form. Form is no different than emptiness. Emptiness is no different from form. But with the beings not having this insight, again, the bodhisattva with a great loving heart contrives expedient means. A key aspect of Mahayana Buddhism is this great loving heart. I think the Sanskrit word is karuna. It also referred to, in another sense, as compassion. The wisdom and compassion are the two key elements within Mahayana Buddhism. And it's a result of this great loving heart that the bodhisattva pursues his or her path of finding ways to relieve suffering among human beings, and in fact among all sentient beings. And a little later in that same paragraph, it references what I had done a separate video about, namely the 6 paramitas, or the 6 perfections, or the 6 practices of a bodhisattva, when in the Lankavatara it says, arriving at the abode of the paramitas and keeping themselves away from the thought of genesis, deed, and discipline, they will attain the samadhi vajra vimbopama, which is in compliance with the Tathagatakaya and with the transformations of suchness. After achieving a revulsion in the abode of the Vijnanas, they will gradually realize the Tathagatakaya. Kaya again means body, so this is talking about the fact that it's through the practice of the 6 paramitas that the bodhisattva eventually becomes a Buddha. That last passage and this next one are from chapter 2, and the Lanka says, perceiving that the triple existence is by reason of the habit energy of erroneous discrimination and false reasoning that has been going on since the beginningless time, and also thinking of the state of Buddhahood, which is imageless and unborn, the bodhisattva will become thoroughly conversant with the noble truth of self-realization, will become a perfect master of his or her own mind, and will conduct himself without effort, will be like a gem reflecting a variety of colors, will be able to assume the body of transformation, will be able to enter into the subtle minds of all beings. This is pointing to what some of the basic problems are that beings have as to why we suffer, namely our erroneous discrimination, the fact that we do break the world down into this and that, good and bad, desirable, undesirable, gain, loss, fame, shame, etc. And that, by virtue, or I should say because of these discriminations and the habit energy associated with them, that these false views, this ignorance becomes entrenched in our minds on the basis of habit. And that it's very hard to break out of this, but that the bodhisattvas are able to understand and sense what the needs are of various people with their various psychologies and desires and needs spiritually, and really manifest themselves as transformation bodies or nirmanakayas, so as to be able to teach beings and to help them get out of their various forms of suffering.